Maybe this will surprise you, or maybe it won't, but the Ukrainian military industry is experiencing a golden era. Missiles, drones, battle tanks. Apart from Western weapons, which have been in short supply lately, the Ukrainians are working hard to develop and manufacture everything they need to repel the Russian invasion. We are talking, for instance, about improved Neptune anti-ship missiles, new precision-guided rocket systems, local anti-tank systems, and even Liutyi kamikaze drones. With a range of almost 800 kilometers, Ukrainian Liutyi drones have become one of the major players in attacks against Russian facilities in the rearguard, and even inside, sometimes deep inside, Russia itself. It's true that many of the new Ukrainian weapons began to be developed before the war, particularly after the occupation of Crimea in 2014. But now, unfortunately, is when we're getting to know them best. Now they have been finalized, perfected, extensively tested, and of course, mass-produced. We're talking about a radical change that has even led to talk that Ukraine could become a major player in the international defense market in a few years' time.
Ukraine's innovative defense industry can play a key role in Western security.
If you told Ukrainians just a couple of years ago that they were going to see headlines like this, they would probably burst out laughing. Because the truth is that, until very recently, the defense sector in Ukraine was in shambles, practically in ruins. They struggled to produce a couple of advanced components, like airplane and helicopter engines, or some turbines for ships and submarines. But that was as far as it went. Everything else was mostly rudimentary equipment, unreliable, and with obsolete technology. Apart from the occasional piece of equipment, the Ukrainian defense industry was rather pitiful, which is surprising. Why? Because Ukraine was home to some of the main epicenters of military equipment production in the entire Soviet Union. In the Ukrainian city of Dnipro, for example, some of the most advanced ballistic missile development was carried out to the point that it was key in the development of space research in the Soviet Union. One of the most important tank plants in the world was located in the city of Kharkiv, and Soviet warships and submarines were built in Mykolaiv. These are just 3 examples. On top of that, the Ukrainians were also very good at developing new technologies, particularly in the aerospace field. However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that huge military fabric collapsed. Widespread corruption, lack of competitiveness, lack of buyers, lack of money to maintain technological developments. Little by little, everything fell apart. And then to top it all off, this.
Bill Clinton says he feels terrible for pushing a 1994 agreement with Russia that resulted in Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons.
Wait, what on earth does Bill Clinton have to do with this story? Well, the problem, above all, was the well-known Budapest Memorandum. And let's see, no, don't worry, we aren't going to talk about boring international agreements in this video, but it's this memorandum that is largely to blame for why we are where we are today. For those of you who don't know, this agreement made Ukraine and other countries such as Belarus and Kazakhstan give all their nuclear weapons to Russia and destroy a good deal of their deterrent weapon systems. It was done in exchange for commitments and guarantees of security and stability, both from the United States and Russia. But anyway, we already know that the story has played out very differently. The point is that, at that time, Ukraine had no money. The maintenance contracts for the strategic forces were replaced by decommissioning contracts, and on top of that, they had a security agreement that supposedly protected them. So why worry about maintaining a modern and competitive military industry? Quite the opposite, in fact. The pro-Russian presidents in Ukraine in the years that followed ignored this precisely, so as not to annoy Moscow. These days, we know it was a mistake, but the reality went much further. Take a look at this graph. For decades, Ukrainian presidents let their own military industry collapse. The percentage of GDP contributed by this industry went from 30% in 1995 to less than 7% in just over 30 years. It's still a high figure, but don't forget that it's a huge percentage of what was struggling to be the poorest country in Europe. I mean, as I was telling you before, Ukraine was manufacturing mostly very rudimentary things. Now, why is all this so important? Because what happened to the military industry also happened to the armed forces. And not surprisingly, a Ukraine with a military in ruins was the perfect scenario for Moscow. Having a country unable to protect itself in its orbit would make it much more amenable to its interests. Or at least, that's what the Russians thought. So again, the pro-Russian presidents of Ukraine did something very similar to what Lukashenko has done in Belarus. They ignored the armed forces. Nevertheless, wait a minute, because as we said at the beginning of this video, things are changing at full speed. In other videos about Ukraine, we've already told you how Zelensky is leading a crusade against against corruption. And he's doing it at all levels: political, judicial, military. And yes, this campaign has also reached the military industry, especially the crown jewel of arms production, the state-owned enterprise, Ukroboronprom. This is a state defense consortium created in 2010 as the merger of the companies Armored Vehicles of Ukraine and Military Technological Service. The merger came after the sector's government-owned companies had become parasitized by corrupt officials. Officials who not only received illegal commissions for buying material at prices far above the market, but even went so far as to steal these materials to build their own houses. We're talking about Ukraine. These things were quite normal until very recently. Of course, with the war, the company has done a 180-degree turnaround. It has changed completely. Not only has it multiplied its production, but it has also been ruthless about corruption. So faced with this radical paradigm shift, on VisualPolitik, we have asked several key questions. How has Ukraine managed to revive its defense industry? What role has the state-owned Ukroboronprom played? Could we be looking at the next big armament center for Europe when the war is over? Keep an eye out for this last question. Let's get on with it.
The joke's over.
Not so long ago, Ukroboronprom was synonymous with inefficiency, corruption, and obsolete technology, a Soviet relic trapped in time. But what was virtually dead weight until recently is today becoming a global defense giant, which of course makes it absolutely crucial to Ukraine's resilience. Do you think we're exaggerating? Well, check this out.
Ukroboronprom joins ranks of world's top 50 defense companies for first time.
And not only that, this manufacturer has managed to become the fastest growing company in its sector in the world. Okay, logically, it's due to the war, but the point is that they are succeeding. This company is even managing to exceed the best expectations.
In 2023, weapons production in Ukraine increased threefold, and in the first 8 months of this year, we have increased production by another 2 times compared to 2023. So we are progressing.
I don't know, what can I say? It's surprising. I mean, it is normal for an arms company to manufacture more in the midst of a war. So far, as I say, no real surprise. But the point is that in a country that's being bombed and where there are no resources to spare, this company has made a spectacular turnaround. Not only is it producing much, much more, but what it is producing is much, much better. It must be that the threat sharpens the wits. But the fact is that this has become one of the keys to Ukraine's resilience. How is it doing it? Well, one of the keys lies in what Kyiv did in 2023 to convert Ukroboronprom into Ukrainian defense industry, a joint stock company. And although for the time being, the state remains its sole owner, this change has caused the company to begin to operate in a completely different way, almost as a private company would. For example, it now operates with a board of directors under market-like regulations and requirements, with more transparency, with experienced professionals at the helm, with talent recruitment, with relentless control of corruption, and well, with everything we would expect from a modern and competitive private company. But the significance of this company is not limited to production. Ukroboronprom is modernizing and repairing tanks and armored vehicles on the battlefield. The company has thus become an actor in the war, not only as a producer of weapons, but also allowing the redeployment of repaired armaments in record time.
Ukroboronprom has repaired more than 3,000 armored vehicles in combat zones.
And that's not even the most brilliant thing it's achieved. This company has even developed real subterranean weapons factories, and it has done so in record time.
The Ministry of Strategic Industries of Ukraine has built a classified network of underground factories to produce weapons, and defense enterprises were moved underground due to large-scale destruction in the first days of the war. Some factories are completely underground, others are camouflaged, hidden by huge scenery.
This is how Ukraine has been able to manufacture ammunition, drones, Neptune anti-ship missiles, Stugna anti-tank missiles, and even Cossack armored personnel carriers underground. But if you find this surprising, there is still more. The Ukrainians no longer see their defense industry as a kind of closed group of 4 producers controlled by the interests of old oligarchs. Now they are signing alliances and agreements with Western industry to obtain financing, know-how, technology licenses, advanced production equipment, and so on and so forth. This is the case, for example, of a recent alliance signed with the German giant Rheinmetall to produce armored vehicles in Ukraine. And this is perhaps one of the best ideas of Zelensky's government. They are trying to turn the war into a huge business for local and also international companies. And yes, I know what some of you are thinking. War? A business? Josh, how can you say that? Don't you have any scruples? How can you say that this barbarism was a good idea? I'm sorry, but we're talking about incentives here. By turning the war into a business for local and international arms companies, the Zelensky government is managing to increase investment in the sector, to multiply production, to boost innovation, and it stands to reason that all this strengthens Ukraine's position. And by the way, guess what? Russia is going in the opposite direction.
Russia nationalized 15 defense firms since 2023, top prosecutor.
In contrast, VisualPolitik has even just opened its first international office in Washington. Because VisualPolitik community, this is not a short-term strategy. The Ukrainians are making it quite clear. Their intention is to become a major player in the military sector now and when the war is over as well. Not least because they understand that this will allow them to, first, to take advantage of all the destruction, to generate dollars with which to rebuild the country. And second, to have a sufficiently deterrent military force to prevent Russia from repeating its aggression. And guess what? This whole story has a main character, Herman Smetanin. For those of you who are fond of VisualPolitik, this name is already familiar to you because we talked about him recently in our video about the change of government in Ukraine, a video that, by the way, will link for you in the description. Well, Smetanin has been the new Minister of Strategic Industries of Ukraine for a few weeks now, and you're about to understand perfectly why he has earned that chair. Before he became minister, Smetanin was the CEO of VisualPolitik, and despite the fact that he hasn't been at the helm of the Ukrainian Military Defense Consortium for long, just since June 2023, his results have been impressive, as you will see. And that's been thanks to the fact that he's introduced a completely new management philosophy. Remember how a moment ago we saw how the Kremlin is nationalizing and intervening in more and more military enterprises? Well, Ukraine is doing just the opposite. If the Russian war economy is based on massive spending and centrally directed production by the state, the Ukrainian one has evolved into a much more entrepreneurial-orientated industry. So how did they do it? Well, basically, by issuing rapid and massive arms production licenses. For example, some agricultural producers have now started to produce mortars and their ammunition. And we aren't talking about small production volumes. Entrepreneur Anatoly Kuzmin, for example, has managed to produce 20,000 mortars every month. This is no joke. As I've already told you, Zelensky's government saw it very clearly. The war had to be an opportunity at the same time. But if there's one thing that this sort of fledgling Ukrainian private military industry is excelling at, it is, of course, war drones. To the point that even more drones are already being produced in Ukraine than the state has the capacity to purchase.
Ukraine's drone industry surges beyond state procurement capacity.
Crazy. Whether it's 3 friends in a garage or a small team in a local workshop, everyone has a free hand to produce military drones. You know, anything goes in times of war. With quick turnaround times, reduced bureaucracy, tax breaks, and even small grants of up to $25,000 each way. Government programs such as Brave One and other measures are slowly bringing a whole private military industry to the fore. In fact, 9 out of 10 drone manufacturing companies in Ukraine are privately owned. And that's something the Ukrainian government loves.
The volume of capabilities this year is 3 times bigger than last year. In 2021, 80% of the sector was state-run. Now it's about 50-50. In 5 years, it should be 80-20 in favor of private.
To give you an idea of how a huge production and innovation ecosystem is sprouting up, take this figure. Today, there are already more than 200 Ukrainian companies supplying drones to the military. That's wild. In a famous battle at Avdiivka, Russian troops spent 40 days trying to take a Ukrainian bunker, losing many soldiers, only to discover that inside was nothing more than a semi-autonomous, remotely controlled turret. This VisualPolitik community is the real difference between a centralized system and an open war economy which promotes the ability to innovate at full speed and adapt nimbly to the needs of the battlefield. This is one of the strategies with which Zelensky's government hopes to close the gap. Even so, as we often say on VisualPolitik, all that glitters is not gold. Listen up.
An obstacle course.
There's no doubt. What the Zelensky administration and key players such as Alexander Kamyshin and Herman Smetanin have achieved has been impressive. They've begun to revive an industry that was practically in intensive care due to corruption and excessive state intervention. Obviously, there are still problems. Prospects are good, but there are many challenges ahead. For example, one of the most serious right now is the lack of labor.
Ukraine confronts labor shortage as need for soldiers drains workforce.
This is something we've already told you in past videos, both here on VisualPolitik and on VisualEconomic. Ukraine lacks workers in all industries, without exception. The exodus of more than 5 million people and the recruitment of hundreds of thousands to fight on the front lines is not without consequences. Thousands of companies have seen their production capacity decline due to labor shortages. One example is the energy company DTEK, which claims to be short at least 100 workers at each of its mines. Metinvest Group, one of Ukraine's largest employers with more than 60,000 workers, claims it has 4,000 vacant positions that it's simply unable to fill. And of course, don't forget the crucial element. Unlike other sectors, the defense sector depends almost exclusively on government spending. And what happens in this case with the Ukrainian government? Well, their spending levels are determined by the solidarity of international allies. For example, Ukraine had a defense budget in 2023 of almost $65 billion, which is even more than that of much richer countries such as France, Japan, or South Korea. How did they do it? With international help. Do you remember that in a past video, we recently stressed how important it can be to keep the money tap running? For the West, the cost would be very low, but the result could not only change the outcome of the war, but also the security situation in Europe and even the global military industry. It's necessary to support with money, but also, why not, with medium and long-term orders to Ukraine's fledgling military industry. Europe and the United States have become sort of venture capital investors, promoting the Ukrainian military industry to grow beyond the war, because the result would be fantastic for everyone. To win the war, to rebuild Ukraine, to strengthen Europe's security, to rearm the West. VisualPolitik community, in this video we've told you not only about the huge potential Ukraine has to become a military colossus, and how for now they seem to be on the right track, we've also just told you why it will be far from a bed of roses. What's more, many of the plans and fabric they have in place now could simply vanish once the conflict is over or the tap from the West is turned off. Ukraine will then have to face its financial problems, consider privatizations, and forge alliances with Western industry if it wants to consolidate its own. Will they? Well, only time will tell. For the time being, the path taken by Zelensky's company is having very good results for the sector and is terrible news for the Russians. But for now, at this point, the questions are for you. What do you think about this sort of war economy of entrepreneurship that Ukraine is building? Do you think that the Ukrainian defense sector could become a global leader due to this war? Do you think that the problems we've just told you about are solvable? Well, as always, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you like this video, please like it, subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so, and thank you very much for watching. All the best, I will see you next time.